Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. We are starting the fourth lecture, Abraham, Abulafia, and the Doctrine of Prophetic Kabbalism. 1. As from the year 1200 of the Common Era, the Kabbalists began to emerge as a distinct mystical group which, while still not numerically significant, had nonetheless attained considerable prominence in many parts of southern France and Spain. The main tendencies of the new movement are clearly defined, and the modern student may without difficulty trace its development in the early stages about 1200 to the golden age of Kabbalism in Spain at the close of the 13th and the early 14th centuries. An extensive literature has preserved for us the highlights of thought and personalities dominating the new mysticism, which, for 5 or 6 generations, was to exercise an ever-increasing influence on Jewish life. Some of the outstanding leaders, it is true, are but lightly sketched, and we have not sufficient data to give us a clear picture of them all. But research of the past 30 years has brought an unexpected harvest of illuminating facts. Nor must it be forgotten that each of the leading figures had its own clearly defined physiognomy, and there was no vagueness of outline to lead to confusion of identity. The same clear lines of demarcation apply also to tendencies, each of which can be distinguished by terminology as well as by the nuance of its mystic thought. This demarcation is intelligible enough when we review the growth of mystical tradition. Teaching by word of mouth and implication rather than assertion was the rule. The numerous allusions found in this field of literature, such as I cannot say more, I have already explained to you by word of mouth. This is only for those familiar with the secret wisdom, are not mere flights of rhetoric. This vagueness, indeed, is the reason why many passages have remained obscure to the present day, in many cases whispers, and that in esoteric hints were the only medium of transmission. It is therefore not surprising that such methods should lead to innovations sometimes startling, and that differentiations arose between the various schools. Even the devout pupil, who leaned heavily on the tradition of his master, found before him a wide field for interpretations and amplification, if he were so inclined. Nor should it be forgotten that the primary source, which was not always a mere mortal, supernatural illumination, also plays its part in the history of Kabbalism, and innovations are made not only on the basis of new interpretations of ancient lore. Hopefully that's because new science has been figured out, but as a result of fresh inspiration or revelation, or even of a dream. A sentence from Isaac HaKohen of Soria, about 1270, illustrates the twin sources recognized by the Kabbalists as authoritative. In our generation, there are but a few here and there who have received tradition from the ancients, or have been vouchsafed the grace of divine inspiration. Tradition and initiation and intuition are bound together, and this would explain why Kabbalism could be deeply conservative and intensely revolutionary. Even traditionalists do not shrink from innovations, sometimes far-reaching, which are confidently set forth as interpretations of the ancients, or as revelation of a mystery which Providence had seen fit to conceal from previous generations. This duality colors Kabbalistic literature for the succeeding 100 years. Some scholars are staunch conservatives who will say nothing that has not been handed down by their masters, and that only in enigmatic brevity. Others frankly delight in innovations based on fresh interpretation, and we have the admission of Jacob ben Shechet of Gerona. Were they not the findings of my heart? I had believed this Moses from Sinai did impart. A third class propounded their views either laconically are at length, without citing any authority, while yet a fourth, such as Jacob, Hakohen, and Abraham Abulafia, lean frankly on the divine revelation, but it is not surprising that so many Kabbalists, illuminates as well as commentators, display a reticence, which is among the factors that led directly to the revival of pseudepigraphic forms in Kabbalistic literature. This pseudepigraphy was, in my opinion, based on two impulses, psychological and historic. The psychological stimulus emanates from modesty and the feeling that a Kabbalist who would have been vouchsafed the gift of inspiration should shun ostentation. The historic impulse, on the other hand, was bound up with the desire to influence the writer's contemporaries, hence the search for historic continuity and the sanctification of authority and the tendency to lend to Kabbalistic literature the luster of some great name from biblical or Talmudic times. The Zohar, or the Book of Splendor, is the most famous, but by no means the sole example of such pseudepigraphy. But not all Kabbalists, fortunately for us, preferred anonymity, and it is thanks to them that we were able to place the authors of the pseudepigraphic writings in their proper historic setting. I think it will be appropriate to sum up the contribution of Spanish Kabbalism to the treasury of Jewish mysticism by characterizing the most outspoken representatives of its main currents. The outspoken illuminates and ecstatics, and, on the other hand, the masters of pseudepigraphy. In the opening lecture, I referred to the fact that Jewish mystics are inclined to be reticent about the hidden regions of the religious life, including the sphere of experiences generally described as ecstasy, mystical union with God, and like. Experiences of this kind lie at the bottom of many Kabbalistic writings, though not, of course, of all. Sometimes, however, this fact is not even mentioned by the author of one bulky volume, Rabbi Mordecai Ashkenazi's book, Eshel Abraham. I have been able to prove, for instance, that it was written against a background of visionary dreams, but for the fact that one of the author's notebooks, a kind of mystical diary, has come down to us, it would be impossible to guess this, for it is in vain that one looks for a single allusion to the source of his ideas. The treatment of the subject remains throughout strictly objective. Other Kabbalists deal at length with the question of the individual's approach to mystical knowledge without any reference to their own experience. But even writings of this kind, if they are really manuals of the more advanced stages of mystical practice and technique, have seldom been published. To this class belongs, for instance, a penetrating analysis of various forms and stages of mystical rapture and ecstasy, written by Rabbi Dov Bar, died 1827 of the Vulgar era, the son of the famous Rabbi Shmuel Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, in his Kuntras ha-Hithpaluth, roughly translated, an inquiry into ecstasy, or take the case of famous Kabbalist Rabbi Haim Vital Calabris, 1543 to 1620, the leading disciple of Rabbi Isaac Luria, himself one of the central figures of later Kabbalism. The celebrated mystic is an author of an essay called Share Kedusha, i.e. the Gates of Holiness. They should really distinguish between K and Q, because that's quite a bit different in meaning. Shar Kedusha, I don't know what spelling they're getting at, but which includes a brief and easily comprehensible introduction into the mystical way of life, beginning with the description of certain indispensable moral qualities, leading up to a whole compendium of Kabbalistic ethics. The first 3 chapters of the little book have been printed many times. and on the whole they make interesting reading. So far, so good. But Vital has added a 4th chapter in which he sets out in detail various ways of imbuing the soul with the Holy Spirit and prophetic wisdom, which, by virtue of its copious quotations from older authors, is really an anthology of the teachings of the older Kabbalists on the technique of ecstasy. You will not, however, find it in any of the printed editions of the book. In its place, the following words have been inserted. Thus speaks the printer, the 4th part will not be printed, for it is all holy names and secret mysteries which it would be unseemly to publish. And in fact, this highly interesting chapter has survived in only a few handwritten copies. It is the same, or almost the same, with other writings which describe either ecstatical experiences or the technique of preparing oneself for them. Now, what, you have to travel across the world and earn or otherwise get the permission of the people who have these texts? There's only a few copies. Print them, Still more remarkable is the fact that even when we turn to the unpublished writings of Jewish mystics, we find that ecstatic experience does not play the all-important part one might expect. It is true that the position is somewhat different in the writings of the early mystics, who lived before the development of Kabbalism, and whose ideas have been outlined in the 2nd lecture. Instead of the usual theory of mysticism, we are treated in these documents of Jewish Gnosticism to enthusiastic descriptions of the soul's ascent to the celestial throne and of the objects it contemplates. In addition, the technique of producing this ecstatic frame of mind is described in detail. In latter Kabbalistic literature, these aspects tend more and more to be relegated to the background. The soul's ascension does not, of course, disappear altogether. The visionary element of mysticism, which corresponds to a certain psychological disposition, breaks through again and again. But on the whole, Kabbalistic meditation and contemplation takes on a more spiritualized aspect. Moreover, the fact remains that even leaving aside the distinction between earlier and later documents of Jewish mysticism, it is only in extremely rare cases that ecstasy signifies actual union of God, in which the human being individually abandons itself to the rapture of complete submersion in the divine stream. Well, depends on how you can rephrase that and say, well, okay, like my channel graphics, you have undefiled knowledge and the absolute righteousness. So you merge consciously in an action, fully submissive, fully surrendered, sort of a more active, less slavish sort of way of thinking of the whole thing. But you still have your individuality. You don't lose that. Just the false ego doesn't play a role, or however you're going to phrase that sort of stuff. Even in this ecstatic frame of mind, the Jewish mystic almost invariably retains a sense of the distance between the Creator and his creature. The latter is joined to the former, and the point where the two meet is of the greatest interest to the mystic, but he does not regard it as constituting anything so extravagant as the identity of Creator and creature. Nothing seems to me to express better than the sense of the distance between God and man. Than the Hebrew term, which in our literature is generally used for what is otherwise unio mystica. I mean the word devakuth, which signifies adhesion or being joined views to God. This is regarded as the ultimate goal of religious perfection. Devakuth can be ecstasy, but its meaning is far more comprehensive. It is a perpetual being with God, an intimate union and conformity with the human and divine will. Yet even the rapturous descriptions of this state of mind, which abound in later Hasidic literature, portraying a proper sense of distance, are, if you like, of incommensurateness. Many writers deliberately place devakuth of any form of ecstasy which seeks the extinction of the world and the self in union with God. I am not going to deny that there have also been tendencies of the opposite kind. An excellent description of the trend toward pure pantheism, or rather a cosmism, can be found in a well-known Yiddish novel, F. Schneerson's Hayam Grauwitzer, and at least one of the famous leaders of Lithuanian Hasidism, Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Staroselje, can be classed among the occultists, but I do maintain that such tendencies are not characteristic of Jewish mysticism. It is a significant fact that the most famous and influential book of our mystical literature, the Zohar, has a little use for ecstasy. The part it plays both in the descriptive and in the dogmatical sections of this voluminous work is entirely subordinate. Allusions to it there are, but it is obvious that other and different aspects of mysticism are much nearer to the author's heart. Part of the extraordinary success of the Zohar can probably be traced to this attitude of restraint which struck a familiar chord in the Jewish heart, too. Considering all the aforementioned facts, it is hardly surprising that the outstanding representative of ecstatic Kabbalism has also been the least popular of all the great Kabbalists. I refer to Abraham Abulafia, whose theories and doctrines will form the main subject of the lecture. By a curious coincidence, which is perhaps rather more than a coincidence, Abulafia's principal works and the Zohar were written almost simultaneously. It is no exaggeration to say that each marks the culminating point in the development of the two opposing schools of thought in Spanish Kabbalism, schools which I should like to call the ecstatic and the theosophical. Of the latter, I shall have something to say in the following lectures. For all their differences, the two belong together. And only if both are understood do we obtain something like a comprehensive picture of Spanish Kabbalism. Unfortunately, not one of Abulafia's numerous and often voluminous treatises have been published by the Kabbalists, while the Zohar runs into 70 or 80 editions. Not until Jelinek, one of the small band of 19th century Jewish scholars who probed deeper into the writings of Jewish mystics, published 3 of his minor writings and some extracts from others, did any of them appear in print. This is all the more remarkable as Abulafia was a very prolific writer who, on one occasion, refers to himself as the author of 26 Kabbalistic and 22 prophetic works. Of the former, many still exist. I know of more than 20, and it is a fact that a few among them enjoy a great reputation among Kabbalists to this day. While some of the more orthodox Kabbalists, such as Rabbi Jehuda Hayat about 1500 of the Common Era, attacked Abulafia with vehemence and warned their readers against his books. Their criticism appears to have roused only a faint echo. At any rate, Abulafia's influence as a guide to mysticism continued to remain very great. He owed this to the remarkable combination of logical power, pellucid style, deep insight, and highly colored abstruseness which characterizes his writings, since, as we shall have occasion to see, he was convinced of having found the way to prophetic inspiration, and from there the true knowledge of the divine. He took pains to use a simple and direct style which went straight to the heart of every attentive reader. He went so far as to include among his works a number of what one might call manuals, which only set out his theory, but also constitute a guide to action. In fact, they can be practiced so easily as to go far beyond his intentions. The point is that although Abulafia himself never thought of going beyond the pale of rabbinic Jewry, his teachings can be put into effect by practically everyone who tries. That probably is also one of the reasons why the Kabbalists refrained from publishing them. Very likely they feared that once this technique of meditation, which had a very broad appeal, became publicly known, its use would no longer be restricted to the elect. Well, if it's supposed to be pleasing to God or effective to bring about what's good spiritually, why leave it to the elect? Certainly, the success of Abulafia's writing made the ever-present danger of a clash between the mystical revelation and that of Mount Sinai seemed more real than ever. Thus, the whole school of practical mysticism, which Abulafia himself called Prophetic Kabbalism, continued to lead an underground life. By withholding his writings from the public, the Kabbalist undoubtedly sought to eliminate the danger that people might go in for ecstatic adventures without due preparations and lay dangerous claims to visionary powers. Generally speaking, lay mystics, self-taught and untutored by rabbinism, have always been a potential source of heretical thought. Well, if you're not conservative, then you can interpret these things for yourself, right? It doesn't mean it's outside the path. Jewish mysticism tried to meet this danger by stipulating in principle that entry into the domain of mystical thought and practice should be reserved to rabbinic scholars. In actual fact, however, there has been no lack of Kabbalists who either had no learning whatsoever or who lacked the proper rabbinic training. Thus, enabled to look at Judaism from a fresh angle, these men frequently produced highly important and interesting ideas, and so there grew up side by side with the scholarly Kabbalah of the rabbis another line of prophetic and visionary mystics. The pristine enthusiasm of these early ecstatics frequently lifted the heavy lid of rabbinic scholasticism, and for all their readiness to compromise, occasionally came into conflict with it. Now, one of the dangers, I guess, is that people exaggerate. Yeah, there are a lot of experiences and stuff we all can have, but these experiences tend to be along the lines of confirming stuff for ourselves. Or doing things for ourselves. It's not, you meditate and you have a strong enough of a vision that you now can be the new prophet or something. It doesn't really work like that, but it also doesn't work like you make your way up the ranks of the conservative schools, and it doesn't work that way either. It is also worth pointing out that during the classical period of Kabbalism, i.e. up to 1300, the Common Era, as distinct from the latter periods, its representatives were, as a rule, not men whom their contemporaries regarded as outstanding rabbis, great Kabbalists who also contributed to strictly rabbinical literature. Men like Moses, Nahmanides, or Solomon ben Adret were rare, yet the Kabbalists were, in the great majority, men of rabbinic education. Abulafia marks an exception. Having had little contact with later rabbinic learning, all the more extensive, however, was his knowledge of contemporary philosophy, and his writings, especially those of a systematic character, show him to have been, by the standards of his age, a highly erudite man. And, approaching with the various philosophies, I mean methods, quotes. That's not doing philosophy. And the new sciences and all that stuff is very important. So that's why religion needs to be in the hands of the people, doesn't it? About Abulafia's life and his person, we are informed almost exclusively by his own writings. Abraham ben Samuel Abulafia was born in Saragossa in 1240 and spent his youth in Tudela in the province of Navarre. His father taught him the Bible with his commentaries as well as grammar and some Mishnah and Talmud. When he was 18 years old, he lost his father. 2 years later, he left Spain and went to the Near East in order, as he writes, to discover the legendary stream Sumbation beyond which the lost 10 tribes were supposed to dwell. Warlike disturbances in Syria and Palestine soon drove him back from Accra to Europe, where he spent about 10 years in Greece and Italy. During these years of travel, he steeped himself in philosophy and conceived for Maimonides an admiration that proved lifelong. For him, there was no antithesis between mysticism and the doctrines of Maimonides. He rather considered his own mystical theory as the final step forward from the Guide of the Perplexed, to which he wrote a curious mystical commentary. This affinity of the mystic with the great rationalist has its astounding parallel, as the most recent research has shown, in the relationship of the great Christian mystic Meister Eckhart to Maimonides, by whom he seems to be much more influenced than was any scholastic before him. While the great scholastics, such as Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, although having learned and indeed accepted much from him, nonetheless frequently oppose him, the rabbi, Rambam, is, as Joseph Koch has ascertained, for the great Christian mystic, a literary authority to whom Augustine at best is superior. In the same way, Abulafia tries to connect his theories with those of Maimonides. According to him, only the Guide and the Book of Creation together represent the true theory of Kabbalism. Consequently, with these studies, he seems to have been deeply occupied with the Kabbalistic doctrines of his age. About, however, being overmuch impressed by them, about 1270 of the Common Era, he returned to Spain for 3 or 4 years, during which he immersed himself completely in mystical research. In Barcelona, he began to study the book Yetzirah and 12 commentaries to it, showing both philosophic and Kabbalistic inclinations. Here, too, he seems to have come into contact with the conventicle, the members of which believed they could gain access to the profoundest secrets of mystical cosmology and theology by 3 methods of Kabbalah, being Gematria, Notarikon, and Temura. Abulafia especially mentions one Baruch Togarmi Precentor as his teacher, who initiated him into the true meaning of the Sefer Yetzirah. We still possess a treatise of this Kabbalist, the keys to the Kabbalah about the mysteries of the book Yetzirah. Most of them, he says, he felt not entitled to publish, nor even to write down. I want to write it down, and I am not allowed to do it. I do not want to write it down, and cannot entirely desist. So I write, and I pause, and I allude to it again in later passages, and this is my procedure. Abulafia himself at times wrote in this vein, so typical of mystical literature. By immersing himself in the mystical technique of his teacher, Abulafia found his own way. It was at the age of 31 in Barcelona that he was overcome by the prophetic spirit. He obtained knowledge of the true name of God and had visions of which he himself, however, says in 1285 that they were partly sent by the demons to confuse him, and that he groped about like a blind man at midday for 15 years with Satan to his right. Yet on the other hand, he was entirely convinced of the truth of his prophetic knowledge. He traveled for some time in Spain expounding his new doctrine, but in 1274 he left his native country for the second and last time. From then on led a vagrant life in Italy and Greece. It was still in Spain that he exerted a deep influence upon the young Joseph Gicatilla, the young Joseph Gicatilla. Do you say the J or the? Oh yeah. Who later became one of the most eminent Spanish Kabbalists. In Italy, too, he found disciples in various places and taught them his new way, partly in pursuit of the philosophy of Maimonides. Quick enthusiasm about his disciples turned quickly into disappointment, and he complained bitterly of the unworthiness of some of those whom he had taught in Capua. He became the author of prophetical writings, wherein he prefers to designate himself by names of the same numerical value as his original name of Abraham. He prefers to call himself Raziel or Zechariah. Only in the 9th year after the beginning of his prophetic visions, he began, as he says himself, to compose distinctly prophetic writings, although he had written before that time other tracts on different branches of science, among them writings on the mysteries of the Kabbalah. In the year 1280, inspired with his mission, he undertook a most venturesome and unexplained task. He went to Rome to present himself before the Pope and to confer with him in the name of Jewry. It seems that at that time he nursed messianic ideas. Well may he have read of such a mission of the Messiah to the Pope in a then very widely known booklet. Thus contained the disputation of the famous Kabbalist Moses ben Nachman with the apostate Pablo Cristiani in the year 1263. Here Nachmanides said, "When the time of the end will have come, the Messiah will be at God's command come to the Pope and ask of him the liberation of his people. And only then will the Messiah be considered really to have come, but not before that." Abulafia himself relates that the Pope had given orders when Raziel would come to Rome to confer with him in the name of Jewry, to arrest him, and not to admit him into his presence at all, but to lead him out of town, and there to burn him. But Abulafia, although informed of this, paid no attention, but rather gave himself up to his meditations and mystical preparations, and on the strength of his visions wrote a book, which he later called Book of Testimony, in remembrance of his miraculous rescue. For as he prepared himself to come before the Pope, 2 mouths, as he obscurely expresses himself, grew on him, and when he entered the city gate, he learned that the Pope, it was Nicholas III, had suddenly died. During the night, Abulafia was held in the college of the Franciscans for 28 days, but it was then set free. And here come the deer. Abulafia then wandered about Italy for a number of years. Of these, he seems to have spent several in Sicily, where he remained longer than in any other place. Almost all his extant works were written during his Italian period, particularly between the years 1279 and 1291. We are altogether ignorant of his fate after the year 1291. Of his prophetic or inspired writings, only